Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. Out of the tragedy and destruction of the Trojan Wars came a man heading west. He was carrying his father on his back, and he was holding the hand of his small son. This isn't Odysseus, it's Aeneas. And in that vision, Virgil gives an image of the first Romans of the empire. Virgil's Aeneid was the great epic poem that formed a founding narrative of Rome. It made such an impact that it soon became a standard text in all schools and wiped away the myths that preceded it. It was written in Augustus' reign at the start of the imperial era and has been called an apologia for Roman domination. It's also been called the greatest work of literature ever written in Europe. But how much was Virgil's poem influenced by the extraordinary times in which it was written? How does it transcend the political pressures of imperial patronage? And what are the qualities that make it such a universal work? With me to discuss Virgil's Aeneid are Catherine Edwards, Senior Lecturer in Classics and Ancient History at Birkbeck College, University of London, Edith Hall, Professor of Greek Cultural History at Durham University, and Philip Hardy, Corpus Christi Professor of Latin at the University of Oxford. Edith Hall, could we start with the first literary sighting of Aeneas? He's a Trojan figure in Homer's Iliad. How do we come across him, and why do you think Virgil picked on him?
Well, Virgil picked on Aeneas for two reasons. One is quite simply that he was the ancestor of Augustus, under whom Virgil is writing, and he's writing a genealogy, an ancestry for him. But the second reason is that he's the most important Trojan to survive the fall of Troy, and Augustus wants to trace back his ancestry to Troy.
And what is he doing in the Iliad?
Well, he's always just number two to Hector, who's the great Trojan warrior. He's, if you like, Hector's deputy, second-best warrior, and he's met on several occasions. He actually meets most of the really important Greeks. This is very important. This is a man who has confronted on the battlefield Menelaus, Diomedes, and several other really top Greek warriors. He's got an extraordinary military record as a hero. The crucial moment, though, comes in Book 20 of the Iliad, where he actually confronts Achilles himself, the super warrior, the son of a goddess. And he's only just escaped certain death at the hands of Achilles because he's whisked off the battlefield by Poseidon. He's always being rescued by the gods in the Iliad. That's the really important thing. And Poseidon actually says, we must rescue him because Zeus will be very, very angry if we don't, because he's got to preserve the Trojan line. He has to survive. We must rescue him. And, by the way, he's always been particularly good about offering gifts to the gods. He's very, very pious.
So it's as if sort of whoever Homer was and put that together was foreshadowing or foretelling that several hundred years later Virgil would come along and need this man.
It is, it really is. I mean, Virgil was very fortunate that there were these passages in the Iliad for him to write to. They're almost prophetic. Scholars these days, though, and it's probably a path we don't want to go down today because it's about the Aeneid, but scholars these days are now thinking that the myths of colonisation from Asia to the west, centering on figures like Aeneas, were much, much earlier than people used to think. It may be that Homer is already composing the Iliad to a colonisation myth.
Can you just outline briefly the adventures, as it were, and the destiny of Aeneas in this in Virgil's 12-book epic?
Right. It's 12 books. The first half, basically, is spent wandering around on a protracted and very painful cruise of the Mediterranean, trying to find the destined homeland. And the second half is spent fighting in it and forging alliances and killing off the people who are opposed to the Trojans coming in. So we start, basically, at Troy, in the imagination anyway, with Troy falling, and by the end of the poem, we're actually killing the main opponent to the Trojans' arrival in Italy. We are founding the Roman race, which is what we're told right at the beginning of the poem. This is the story of the great struggle to found the Roman race.
Philip Hardy, can you give us something of the cultural context? Edith was already mentioned this was written under Augustus at the time of the first Emperor Augustus, who'd beaten Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, and he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And so we're just a few decades BC, and there's a great flourishing of writers at that time, a magnificent flourishing, Livy, Horace, Ovid and Virgil. So can you just fill out that context in which Virgil finds himself?
Yes, and the coming of Augustus to power coincided with the maturation of Roman culture, literature and art. For a couple of centuries before that time, Greek culture and art had been pouring into Rome, and the Romans had been assimilating it. as far as literature goes, in the generation before Virgil, a number of writers, in particular Catullus and his circle, and Lucretius, had polished the Latin poetic language, which was, as it were, ready there for Virgil to take up and create this great classic, which was writing in the first 10 years of Augustus's reign, between 29 and 19 BC, the death of Virgil. And Virgil was a contemporary of other poets, particularly Horace, with whom Virgil was very close indeed, love elegists like Propertius and Tibullus. So the creation of a new political order, restoring stability after the civil wars of the previous decades, coincided perhaps fortuitously with this great maturation of culture, art and literature.
It's a subject in itself, but it's a fascinating subject. When you have a renaissance of such intensity, you wonder, is this patronage, is this fortune? We know that Augustus himself wrote plays, although not many, there aren't any sort of traces that might be found. Other things are being found at the moment, which so there's that. We know there's a man called Maecenas who was a great patron of the arts on Augustus' behalf. So do you think it was direct patronage that stimulated this, or was something else going? I know it's unanswerable, but I would like to know what your essay is.
Well, patronage certainly exploits it. One has to be a little careful in thinking about any very directed patronage from the centre. I mean, there are people who think that the Aeneid was more or less written to order, but I think that is to overemphasise the directness of the relationship between Augustus and Maecenas, his right-hand man, who is, if you like, his minister of culture, but that will be a rather anachronistic way of putting it. One has to beware of, for example, taking the model of Italy and Germany in the 30s, and one shouldn't think of a Ministry of Information as such. But certainly the rewards for poets like Virgil and Horace were great, and we're told that at his death Virgil had an estate of 10 million sesterces, much of which may have come from...
Sorry, sesterces.
It's a unit of Roman currency. 10 million sesterces is a lot of money. So Virgil was certainly rewarded for his writing. But, as you say, Augustus was a very cultured man, and he would have valued literature that was not just banging an ideological drum.
Finally, can you just give us a little bit about Virgil himself? As I understand it, we don't know a great deal, but it seems he was the son of a farmer, perhaps?
Yes, he came from the north of Italy, from a village near Mantua, which had quite recently become enfranchised in the Roman citizenship. He was educated in the north of Italy. He then came south. He spent some time in the Bay of Naples at the school of an Epicurean philosopher before coming to Rome. One shouldn't overestimate his humble background. He would have had a very good education, and indeed one remarkable fact about the Roman poets is that hardly any of them come from Rome itself. They mostly come from outside Rome.
Catherine Edwards, the initial image I gave at the beginning of the programme, Aeneas carrying his father out of Troy, holding his son by his hand. We have the past, the present, the future of what will be Rome. That's a very emphatic notion. It's already been mentioned by Edith Hall and amplified by Philip Hardy that this was written under Augustus, the first emperor. He wanted to create a new sort of Rome, pretend it was a republic, but it was an imperium. Can you explain why Aeneid, why Virgil might have started with that? Why that was such an important image for Augustus as well as for Virgil?
Well, that image of of Aeneas, and yes, confusing the two is perhaps an interesting slip. That Aeneas, with his father on his back and holding his son by the hand, is a kind of an archetypal image of Aeneas, and it embodies really pietas, piety towards the family. And that was a very important virtue in terms of how Augustus himself was perceived. Augustus, as has already been mentioned, was the adoptive son of Julius Caesar, and he claimed that in taking up arms after Caesar's murder, he was avenging his father, and that was an act of pietas in itself. So his relationship with his father was a very important part of legitimating his own rise to power.
And he traced his own ancestry because he was the son of Julius Caesar's wife's uncle, is that right? I mean, it sounds like my mother talking about people in Wicken, really. But anyway,
he was Caesar's great nephew.
Yes, he was Caesar's great nephew. And they traced their line, they said they could trace their line back to Aeneas.
That's right, back to Aeneas' son, Iulus.
Yes. So we have the context there for Augustus being allied with Aeneas. How
Yes.
far, to just take further what Philip was saying, how far do you think this was written for Augustus? I mean, there seems to be a balance here from what I've read from the three of you before this programme. It wasn't mere propaganda by any means. On the other hand, it was written under Augustus, who was a great patron and interesting and demanding man. So can you just open that up a bit? Because it serves Augustus' purpose very well. Let's leave it at that.
I think it's absolutely true to say it serves Augustus' purpose well. The story was around in Rome in Latin literature before the time of Augustus, so it was already an important story, even back in the 3rd century BCE, when Rome was in conflict with Greeks. But it comes to have a new importance under Augustus. And in terms of how the poem is perceived in antiquity, I mean, one can say, that it's a problem to say it's specifically written for Augustus, or Augustus has commissioned it, perhaps. But in terms of how it's received in antiquity, it is received as a poem which endorses Augustus. When Ovid writes a few decades later about the Aeneid, he calls it your Aeneid when he's writing to Augustus. And Servius, commentator on the Aeneid in the 4th century, one of his opening comments is to say the Aeneid is written because Virgil wanted to be the Roman Homer and because he wanted to praise Augustus through his ancestors.
But he gives Augustus a great deal because you come from Troy, you're a great survivor, this man is a man of destiny. He's also driven by the gods and goddesses in it. Yes. I mean, there's a verse here, you promised once a progeny divine of Romans, rising from the Trojan line, and after time should hold the world in awe, and to the land and ocean give the law.
Yes.
So he's giving that to Aeneas, and he's handing that on to Augustus inside the poem, isn't he?
That's absolutely right, and I think it's very important to see the mission of Aeneas himself within the poem is to get his sort of straggling bunch of survivors to a new homeland. But it's a homeland that has this brilliant future already set out for it. And that's a future which is going to be brought to fruition under Augustus. One of the important things about Aeneas is that he's actually awfully unwilling to pursue his project in many ways. He's a man who's sort of weighed down by despair at the beginning of the programme. He doesn't really want to leave Troy, but he's forced into this. He's not a man who is out there pursuing his own glory. He's not out there, on his mission for his own ambition, but because he has to do it as his duty. And I think in that sense, there's a sort of elision of Aeneas's project in finding a new home for his people and the larger Roman project of empire, which is, in a sense, made more is dissociated perhaps from the quest for glory, which one might otherwise be tempted to associate with it.
And these tensions between, say, destiny and passion, and between duty and love, are most fiercely portrayed, Philip Hardy, when Aeneas is blown off course a few times, but most importantly when he, in Book 1, he goes to Carthage and he meets Dido, the founder and queen of Carthage, and he sees a frieze where his own story is told, and that takes him into a conversation and a love affair, a massive love affair. Before that, we've mentioned, I did in the introduction, the sort of peerlessness of the Latin. Could you read a few lines of Latin from this point and then tell us what they say?
Yes, I'll take the passage in which a very famous phrase, lacrimae rerum, tears of things, occurs. And this is a moment where Aeneas, having been shipwrecked at the very beginning of Book 1 and nearly lost his life, has landed with difficulty on the coast of Carthage. He arrives in what seems a wilderness. He doesn't know whether it's inhabited. And he makes his way in from the coastal wilderness to this splendid new city that is being built. And at this point, he's actually come inside the city and he enters a temple of the goddess Juno, and in this temple there are very fine works of art, a frieze, which he and his faithful companion Achates look at, and these scenes depict the Trojan War, that is to say, Aeneas's own past. And this is a very emotional moment for Aeneas, who has both reached civilization after fearing that he might never see civilization again. He sees these great works of art, and what is more these artworks represent his own past. And he then reacts in this following passage. I'll read it in Latin and then say a bit about it. Constitit et lacrimans, quis iam locus inquit acate, quae regio in terris nostri non plena laboris. Ein priamus, sunt hic etiam sua primia laudi, sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortalia tangunt. Solve metus, feret haec aliquam tibi fama salutem. Sic ait, atque animum pictura pescit inani, multa gemens, largo crumectat flumina vultum. The passage is framed with tears. Aeneas weeps when he sees these scenes, and tears occur both at the beginning and ending of this excerpt. And Aeneas says, what place on earth is there that is not full of our sufferings? And then he utters this famous line, sunt lacrimae rerum, there are tears of things, et mentem mortalia tangunt, and mortal things touch the mind with splendid sound effects. The phrase lacrimae rerum and what it means has been endlessly discussed. It's a very good example of the way in which Virgil actually strains at the limits of Latinity. The tears of things, what kind of a genitive, objective genitive tears shed for things, or possessive genitive, the tears that in here belong to things. And those two words have often been taken out of context and used almost as a motto for the sensibility and pathos of the poem.
Thank you. And then he meets Dido and tells her his story. Can you put Dido into this? Because Dido, the book, which is the one that I studied at school, and anybody who did Latin at school listening to this programme about the same time who did the Aeneid would study that book. It was Augustus' favourite book. People are supposed to have wept it at the time and ever since. It's extraordinary moving, this passionate love affair, then destiny drives through passion. So can you tell us about Dido, what happened between them, and then what happened?
Dido is an absolutely magnificent woman. She's a worthy companion and consort for Aeneas. It's the near miss, it's the great near miss of history. She's Queen of Carthage. She's a widow. She's decided to dedicate her life to building up Carthage and being Queen of Carthage, and she thinks that she marries Aeneas in a cave where they have an absolutely sort of passionate encounter, but it's not a true marriage, and eventually he must leave her, even though we are emphatically told several times, really does love her with all his heart, because his destiny is to found Rome, and Rome is not to be in alliance with Carthage. In fact, quite the opposite. Rome is destined to be a deadly enemy of Carthage. The important thing about this book, though, I think, is, from the point of view of the Aeneid, is that it's got a lot of very dramatic speeches. It's got about love. It's got extraordinary long dialogues and encounters between the two lovers, and that's the only book like it in the poem, which does not speak of love most of the time at all. And that is why it's everybody's favourite book. And everybody has got a tragic love affair in their past. And there is nobody whose mind this mortal thing does not touch.
Catherine Edwards, when Aeneas is ordered to leave Dido, can you tell, for those who might not have read it, what happens, what she does, and why he is driven in this way? Can we come back to the founding of Rome notion in all this? I still think that was terrific. I wish you'd have gone on for hours about that, Philip, but we didn't have time. Can you just take us to why they left and what this Rome idea? But let's bring that back into the discussion.
Right. Well, when Dido and Aeneas get together, rumours start circulating about their association, and Dido's neighbour Iarbas gets to hear about it.
Oh, there's a big passage rumour, isn't there?
That's right. And Iarbas prays to Jupiter, and he says, this is dreadful, this is appalling, I've made all these sacrifices to you and so on, and now look, this is happening. Again, I wanted to marry Dido and she refused me, and now she's gone off with an Aeneas guy. So this worries Jupiter, and he sends Mercury to tell Aeneas to get on with the job. He's meant to be founding Rome, and what's he doing hanging around in Carthage? So Mercury tells Aeneas he's got to get on with it, and Aeneas is torn. He starts to make preparations to go, and he doesn't tell Dido, and she finds out, and then he's really in for it, and that's when we get these sort of great torrents of passion as Dido takes Aeneas to task for having deceived her. And there's a sort of scholarly debate about whether it really was a marriage or not. The the marriage is actually referred to at the time as culpa, a sin, a crime. So it looks as though Dido is self-deceived as much as anything else. But nevertheless, she is passionately outraged by Aeneas' behaviour, and she threatens that she will kill herself. This doesn't necessarily seem like a threat that's going to be carried out, except that we've already been warned earlier in the poem that Dido is going to die. And so that there is this passionate exchange, and then Aeneas says he must leave. I'm going to Italy, not of my own accord. Italiam non sponte sequor, he says. And off he goes. But then Dido plans that she will kill herself, and she makes a pyre out of on top of which she puts the sort of marriage bed, and she sort of commits suicide with Aeneas' sword, and calls down curses on him. And one aspect of her curse is to set up the future conflict between Rome and Carthage, because she calls for an avenger from Carthaginian blood who will...
Ex rear aliquis nostris ex ossibus altor. It's one day Hannibal will come along and get you.
Yes, because she curses Rome. She said we will never get... But also it brings into the Augustan play of things, doesn't it? Because Virgil is writing in the time of Augustus, the idea of the North African queen who was Cleopatra. And so this... Cleopatra must be playing in people's minds while thinking about Dido.
That's absolutely right. And Mark Antony, Augustus' great opponent in the Civil War, had been allied with Cleopatra. They were defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31. Cleopatra committed suicide in 30, so just a few years before the poem was being written. She too was a great North African queen, and there are all sorts of ways in which Dido and Cleopatra are assimilated. And at one point, Dido is described as being pallida morte futura, pale with death to come. And that's a phrase that's almost exactly echoed at the end of Book 8, where we have the shield of Aeneas described, and there are scenes on it from Rome's future history. One of the central scenes is the Battle of Actium, where we see Augustus defeating Cleopatra, and Cleopatra there is described as pale with death to come.
Sorry, he did actually visit on the travels in the Aeneid. There is before he gets to Carthage, we have very carefully gone to Actium.
Yes, that's right. They visit Actium along
which
the way.
has made sure the Battle of Actium is
already in our
people's
minds.
head, that this is the moment that Augustus did actually win the world.
There's perhaps a general point to make there about the relationship of the Aeneid to Roman history. One of the greatnesses of the poem is that Virgil decided not to write a historical epic about the exploits of Augustus himself, and that was perhaps the major decision when he was planning the poem. He decided instead to write about the remote, legendary Homeric past, characters who do not appear in Roman history, but through whom Virgil is thereby enabled to allude in subtle and indirect ways to actual characters from Roman history. Dido is, in some respects, Cleopatra, but she's also a lot of other things. She is Homeric characters, Circe, Calypso, and that is one of the ways in which the poem is able to transcend the immediate historical context by being open to lots of different ways of reading the characters.
When Aeneas goes to the underworld, as Odysseus did, is that a direct? It seems like, is it a direct image? And what does he find there in his underworld?
Well, yes, so it's based very directly on Odysseus' journey to the land of the dead in the Odyssey. All books of the Aeneid are very closely modelled on things in Homeric poems, and that's a very deliberate imitative strategy on Virgil's part. When Odysseus goes to the land of the dead, he meets characters from his past, from Troy, his mother, and he learns a little bit about the immediate future, about how he's going to get back to his home Ithaca. When Aeneas visits the underworld, he sees likewise people from his own past, including climactically Dido. But more importantly, Aeneas sees the future, and this time it's the future stretching far into the distance, down to the time of Augustus, and this is through the device of a parade of the unborn souls of future Roman heroes, who are displayed to Aeneas by his dead father Anchises, a very strange device, but it is the major forward-looking prophetic section in the poem.
Edith Hall, in the underworld, also, Anchises, Aeneas' father, gives a speech on cosmology. So we're talking about a book that has got many, many strands. Can you just open that up a bit for us?
Well, I think it's one of the most important aspects of the Aeneid as a whole, that it tries to, and very, very much succeeds in making the destiny of Rome part actually of a cosmic order. It's actually got a whole philosophical and indeed scientific dimension. Rome must rise as inevitably as the planets revolve around the sun, basically. Philip's actually the person who's written the great book called Cosmos and Imperium, in which this speech of Anchises that shows how the religious beliefs about what happens to souls when they die actually are part of the panoply of the inevitability of the rise of Roman history. The Aeneid manages to combine the philosophical with the religious, with the historical, with the aesthetic in a completely unprecedented way.
Philip.
Yes. Yes, the speech that Anchises gives to his son is in two parts, and the bit that people tend to remember is the second and longer part, which is, as I said, this review of future Roman history through these unborn heroes. But the first part is this very grandiose account of the nature of the world and the nature of the soul, which uses philosophical language, particularly the kind of language that Lucretius, the great Roman philosophical poet who had written a poem on the Epicurean view of the world, a generation before Virgil, and Virgil directs this philosophical language, the sublime questions of physics, and gives us this speech which functions as a kind of overture to the Parade of Heroes, framing Roman history, suggesting, as Edith says, that somehow Roman history is the inevitable consequence of the way that the world has been created.
Catherine Edwards, is the philosophy as indicated by Edith and by Philip, is this very pleasing to Augustus? Is he saying something that will please Augustus' view of the world at that time?
Well, I think it'd be quite hard to pin down Augustus' particular philosophical predilections. I mean, in some ways, one could see some problems in the earlier philosophical part of the speech in relation to the great Roman project, in that one of the themes of Anchises' speech is that the kind of embodied life on Earth is actually rather wretched, and it's much better to be dead. And that would seem to be somewhat in tension with this celebration of Rome's glorious earthly achievements, which comes in the latter part of the speech. So
yes, and the immediate trigger for that speech is a question from Aeneas, who sees the souls waiting to drink of Lethe and clamouring to go up again to the world above, using a Pythagorean notion of reincarnation. And Aeneas, who thinks that life up on Earth is pretty hellish, in fact, wonders why do they want to go back? And Anchises explains, well, this is the nature of the soul, and there is this cycle of reincarnation, and before the souls go up, they drink of the river of Lethe, so they have forgotten, and that is why they're willing to go to the world above. So that is a very pessimistic, really, view of human life. But the speech also works in this other way to give this sort of grand overture to Roman history. So it's typical of the complexity of Virgil's poetry.
Can I bring in, Catherine, what might seem a very rather crude dichotomy that when you look at it again, is that it seems to be, say, it's about destiny of Aeneas, the duty of Aeneas,
yes.
And at the same time it's about the passion of Dido, and we're going to come to the passion of Turnus and the anger. So passion and anger and destiny and duty, and the gods are there, and it isn't a simple story of a man's got to do what a man's got to do, and does it?
By no means, no. But it is. There are all sorts of elements in this poem which explore intense emotion, and the poem begins with the anger of Juno. That's what kind of sets things in motion. It's Juno's anger. Well, a female. That's right. The goddess Juno sets things in motion. She wants to stop the Trojans from fulfilling their mission to found Rome, because she's the great lover of the Greeks, and also supporter of Carthage. Now, so there's the passion of Juno, there's the passion of Dido, the anger of Turnus, and furor, this word for intense passion, is something that comes up in talking about Dido's love as well. So I mean, there's a definite kind of link with those sort of very angry, passionate characters. And Aeneas is someone who seems to be always put in a position where he needs to overcome emotion and pursue duty. So it looks as though founding Rome is a project which involves kind of putting the larger purpose before your personal feelings.
But despite the anger of Juno and the power of Dido, the place of women in the book, there's the absence total of Aeneas's first wife, and so on. So women are... Is marginalised the word, or what? Well, actually, Juno, don't call her marginal.
I certainly don't think women are marginalised. A lot of people these days argue that it's hopelessly sexist and beyond redemption precisely because women are constantly the empty vessels into which the gods inject nasty, bad furor and passion and sexual feelings and emotion which are destructive. You've also got the women of Troy who burn all the ships on Sicily because they're so upset with having to be dragged on and on and on round the Mediterranean, nearly wrecking the whole enterprise. It's usually women, or it's Turnus, who's equated with Dido in all kinds of ways and is very young and very gorgeous. But I don't think it is. I actually think that you have to take the poem as a whole, and Dido is very carefully exculpated in all kinds of ways. It's the goddesses, the machinating goddesses who take her off her vow of celibacy, and it actually says before this she had achieved peace of mind, and she's just so memorable. She transcends the poem, as does Camilla, who is the great Amazonian Italian queen who people don't talk about. She's absolutely stunning. She's like Joan of Arc.
But it is important, isn't it, that the sort of the powerful women are the ones who die, and the only woman who survives the poem is Lavinia, who doesn't speak.
Yeah, but they die in the poem's own terms, but the fact is the way they've been written means that they have more people know about Dido than about Aeneas.
Well, there is a great contrast with the women of Homer, and there are no powerful, successful women in Virgil, unlike Penelope, or Helen, who in her own way is both very powerful and successful survivor. And Camilla, Edith referred to Camilla, is perhaps the greatest female figure, well, after Dido in the Aeneid. She's an Amazonian queen. She's a woman out of place trying to fight in a man's world, and inevitably she dies a tragic death. But that sense of loss is
very great.
It is, yes.
It's great, but I think we should also pay attention to some of the details of the death of Camilla, which is in many ways parallel to the death of Dido. Lots of people die in the Aeneid, but it's... Camilla and Dido are the only ones who die very long, drawn-out, painful, eroticised deaths, and I think there's something actually we could see something rather sinister in that these, that obviously it is a very complex poem, but I think in it...
Virgil's sexuality is certainly quite strange. I mean, the first erotic scene in the poem is a meeting between Venus, who's dolled herself up in a very kinky get-up, meeting her son, which is actually modelled on a scene in a Homeric hymn, an early Greek hymn, to Aphrodite or Venus, where Aphrodite seduces Aeneas' father Anchises, and from this union will be born Aeneas. So that is the first erotically charged encounter with these overtones of incest at the beginning of the poem, and it sort of goes on from there.
I think that's a very strange reading. I'm sorry, Philip. I think that the greatness of this poem is that Aeneas actually never, ever, he has to renounce all forms of real emotional support that he's ever offered. And in the end of that encounter, when she disappears, he says, "Why won't you just once, mother, let me talk to you?" He has never had a mother because she's a goddess. He loses his father. As soon as he loses his father, he washes up on Carthage, and he's offered love. He then has to renounce that. This guy, he doesn't even love Lavinia, as far as we can make out, who's the Italian princess that the alliance with whom he's going to make Troy. I think his personal sacrifice and lack of love is another way which is rather, to me, more satisfying than just saying that Virgil liked kinky sex with...
Well, yes, again, one can trivialise it, but and there is a great debate, of course, as to whether Aeneas was in love with Dido. We know that Dido was in love with Aeneas, but Virgil is very reticent on the subject of Aeneas' own feelings. It's only in Book 6, when Aeneas sees the ghost, the shade of Dido in the underworld, that the word love, amor, is used of Aeneas' feelings. But I think there are strong hints earlier on, and one of them is the way in which the first appearance of Dido in Book 1 is in a form that will remind Aeneas of that previous apparition of his mother, Venus, whom Aeneas Aeneas mistakes, are you perhaps Diana, the goddess of chastity, not the goddess of love? And the simile at the moment of the first appearance of Dido compares her to Diana. So there are very strange undercurrents here.
We have to get on to the founding of Rome. I'm very sorry, we haven't got on much time, and it has to be founded before we finish. And here we meet Turnus, about whom we've talked, and people might not be familiar with Turnus. So could you tell us who Turnus was when Aeneas got to Italy, and fill in that, and then what happened next between Turnus and Aeneas?
Okay, Turnus is the prince of the Rutilians. He's actually engaged to marry Lavinia, who's the daughter of King Latinus. So when Aeneas comes, and he's the man from the east who is destined to marry Lavinia, obviously Turnus is displaced, and in a way he plays Hector to Aeneas's Achilles in the last books of the Aeneid, and he's a great warrior. He's also fired with almost madness by Juno, who urges him on to fight. And so you have this ongoing battle between the Trojans and the Italians, or some of the Italians, because Aeneas is in alliance with others of the Italians, and culminating in the single combat between Aeneas and Turnus at the end. And then we have Aeneas killing Turnus and thereby cementing his own settlement in Italy.
But the killing of Turnus in itself has caused a lot of discussion, because he had wounded him. He could have spared him, but decided to kill him because Turnus had killed his best friend Pallas. And again, there's an analogy with the Odyssey. Could you? A lot of people are disturbed by that. Again, it seems to say, look, you're presenting to Augustus not a sort of harmonious ending. You're presenting this savage act of vengeance to end this poem.
Well, I think that here Aeneas, he's avenging Pallas, who has been a sort of adoptive son, and I think that is the crucial thing. He has said, I will look after this young Latin, and that adoptive relationship, that he's avenging that. He sees his baldric on Turnus, and it's that inflames him right at the end. So we have the theme of avenging that father-son relationship right at the end, which brings us back to Augustus. However, Turnus in a way wins. Again, I think we have to be very complex about this. Just before he dies, Juno cuts the deal with Jupiter that says that, OK, the Trojans will stay, but they are going to have to change their language to Italian. And they are going to have to take on the Italian religion and the old Italian ways. And that's because that is what Turnus puts into Rome as the Italian warrior. So we may have the blood from Troy, but we're going to have the old ways of Italy for the Roman Empire. So Turnus lives on in an incredibly important way. And I think that tends to get underestimated because people are so worried about Aeneas finally losing it.
Do you think that the end that is in the end of the poem now is the end that Virgil intended? Because he died, some people think, before he'd finished it. And there's also something recorded that he said he wanted to destroy. So we could explore those two. Well, he died anyway before he said it was finished, and then that he wanted it destroyed.
Yes, the ancient lies of Virgil tell us that he left it incomplete and he wanted to take another 3 years to polish it up. And there are some signs of incompletion, most notably half lines that he would not have left as half lines. And there is this story that Virgil, on his deathbed, asked for the Aeneid to be burned, but Augustus overruled it, and that's been the source of a great myth of the unfinished and perhaps unfinishable poem, much imitated by later poets, despairing or pretending to despair of their work. Is the ending that Virgil would have intended? I think certainly yes, and it is a very sudden surprise ending. It's a surprise ending that goes with the surprise beginning. The beginning of the Aeneid is the classic in medias res, launching into the middle of the action, beginning with a storm, a very violent storm that nearly overwhelms Aeneas in the middle of his journeyings. This is not the beginning of his wanderings from Troy, and corresponding to that very sudden, violent beginning, we have this very sudden, violent end, and at the end, in a way, Aeneas embodies figuratively the forces of the storm that had nearly destroyed him at the beginning. So there is a kind of neat symmetry about it, but it nevertheless is a surprising and shocking ending, but deliberately so, I think.
Catherine, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think it's perhaps also worth bearing in mind another dimension in terms of the historical context, and insofar as one wants to pursue a parallel between Aeneas and Augustus. Augustus, in his career, had hardly exemplified a kind of absence of emotion and restraint. During the Civil War years, he was involved in a number of extremely violent acts of for instance, putting people to death after the Battle of Perusia. He had begged for mercy. Augustus himself, at certain points in his career, was known for these bloodthirsty acts. And in some ways, one could see Aeneas's allowing anger to overcome him at the end as perhaps serving also to legitimate some moments in Augustus' career that he might have felt rather problematic.
Yes, although many people would say that Augustus would have wanted to forget those actions, and one thing he did was to change his name from Octavian to Augustus, and one consequence of changing your name is to put your past behind you. So there is a big question about how that pre-Augustus, as it were, past, how much that should be allowed to colour our reading of the poem. And I think today the three of us have been mostly presenting a fairly sort of pro-Augustan, as it were, picture of the Aeneid, that this is a poem that constructs a Roman and a specifically Augustan identity. But it's fair to say that the orthodoxy among at least Anglo-American readers of Virgil, critics today, is that the poem is anything but 100% pro-Augustus, and many contemporary readers actually regard it as subversive and would say that the end of the poem undercuts a lot of what has been the work that has been done in the rest of the poem.
But they have to say that because they are living in a post-colonial era, and if they think that if they say it's pro-Augustan and they carry on reading it, that will get them into trouble. It's about contemporary politics of empire. You know, the discussion of the poem has got implicated in American, Anglo-American feelings about empire. It's a problem.
It is. We haven't got any time to talk about this. It's a damn nuisance, really. But I mean, the fact is, it influenced Dante and Milton, and it was a big influence on British imperial life in the 19th century. Now, how can we do that in half a minute? I haven't a clue. Anybody in the office around the table?
Well, I think it's incredibly... I think what we also haven't talked about is beauty. This poem is visionary. It may be that its vision is a utopia ushered in by Rome, but I think if we hang on to that utopia and this visionary nature of it, we begin to understand why it's inspired everybody, and it's perfectly all right to like it.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Edith Hall, Catherine Edwards and Philip Hardy. Next week we'll be talking about sensory perception with Richard Gregory, Gemma Calvert and David Moore. And thank you very much for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.